Good morning, everyone, from here in Sydney, and good evening to you, Ali, in Florida tonight. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to everyone. We're going to be talking about a developmental approach to feedback. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Ali.
Uh-huh. Well, Andrea, I first of all just want to say thank you so very much for inviting me to be part of your groundbreaking work. I'm so grateful and I feel very honored. You and I have been talking about this and we have been planning for this for a long time. So I'm really excited to be here with everyone. And I thank you for this little piece of your time. I wish that we had, many hours to be together, but I promise I'm going to do my best to share all that I've learned from leaders like yourselves about feedback and how important it is today. So you asked me to tell you a little bit about feedback. And so I guess one of the reasons that, my colleague, Jessica Bloom DiStefano, and I were really, really interested in feedback is because it is one of the primary ways in which we can grow. And it's really hard for people to give feedback that other people can take in and do something with. Some people refer to it as actionable feedback. Other people refer to it as performance feedback. And what we call it is a developmental approach to feedback. And I guess if I had to say like one big word that connects to a developmental approach is differentiating, so that other people can hear it and take it in. A one size fits all does not work when we're thinking about giving feedback to different people in our care. We are constantly differentiating for, children and adolescents. And one of the things that we often take for granted is that adults are all grown up. And really adulthood can be a time of tremendous growth if we know how to differentiate for people in our care, to talk with them, to communicate with them, to give feedback in a way that they can actually take it in and do something with it. It does not mean by any stretch of the imagination lowering our expectations at all. It means holding our expectations, holding ourselves and others accountable, but communicating in a way so that they can actually take it in.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Ali, for that. What actually is feedback? Because a lot of people say, what is feedback? And a lot of the time it gets that negative because people have had feedback once a year and it's because of their performance and the way they give into it. So we'll get into a lot more of that later. But it's interesting when you say to people, what is feedback? Sometimes they come up with positive things like about growth and about development and positive confirmation or affirming what you're doing it well. But then a lot of times people have had those really poor experiences with feedback that have really hit them hard. So tell me why you think feedback is really important today.
Yes. So, one of the questions that we talked about was, why is it important? Well, feedback is one of the primary ways in which we can grow. And feedback is part of everything. It's part of coaching, it's part of mentoring, it's part of teaming. I often get called in to help people with their teams, and sometimes they'll ask us for help with feedback. And then as we get closer to the time that we are going to be working together around a developmental approach to feedback, someone might whisper in my ear or say very softly, what the problem that we have here is that we really can't communicate well with each other. We can't talk to each other. We can't communicate across all kinds of visible and invisible diversities. So in the new normal, teaming and collaboration and giving feedback are part of the air we breathe. And if we're going to grow on the inside, our own capacities, we need help in doing that. I mean, especially in light of the triple pandemics that we're in, COVID-19, the racial pandemic, and the economic pandemic, those are global phenomenon that we're all living in. And we're now trying to communicate online, remotely, hybridly. We're even coaching online right now.
Yeah.
And, someone asked this really great question the other day around how do you show affection online when you're coaching someone? And I thought that was really important. And also, how do we give feedback to other people when we're, a lot of people say, oh, I always read people's body languages. And
yeah.
Right. And like right now, we basically see people from the neck up, maybe the shoulders up. And there's a lot that goes on below the shoulders, So you asked, and thank you, Andrea, for the question, why is it so important today? It's part of our, really the air that we breathe. And if we're working in teams, or we're working one-on-one, or we're working with another adult in any capacity, feedback is a really essential piece of supporting each other and, meeting each other where we are.
Yeah. And I wish that I had your book or books more on feedback when I first started teaching, because as a new teacher, you get so much feedback, which you're like a sponge. You want to learn as much as you can, and you believe that's where you're at. You're at the beginning of your career, so learning is what it's all about. But even giving feedback, as you develop as a teacher, and then you're providing, you're sharing your experiences with others, it would have been really good for me to know a little bit more about why sometimes feedback lands really well and why feedback doesn't, and really you might provide the feedback, it's whether they take that on as well. So what are some of the common challenges faced in relation to feedback? What are the common things that can cause that?
So we did an extensive review of the literature in both the business field and in education, and feedback, teachers and educators, we've been giving feedback to students in various forms for, our whole careers. And more recently in the field of education, we've become more and more interested in how do we give feedback to each other as adults. That has always been the case in the business world as well. And so what we did was we looked at both fields and we tried to come up with what are not only the best practices, but also the most common challenges. And we emerged, in our analysis, the following emerged. So the first one is that there's a lack of good feedback. That was said in the business world and the education sector. The second one that we came up with was that there's inconsistency in terms of how people give feedback to the same person. So that can be very hard for someone who's making sense of their experience in a way where they really are trying to please the multiple supervisors or leaders who are caring for them. And the third is that oftentimes we use a one-size-fits-all approach when trying to give feedback, and that doesn't work. So the results are mixed in terms of how we were giving feedback to each other and like the results of that feedback. And so a developmental approach to feedback, like really sort of tuning in to where a person is. We use the metaphor of, when you're the old fashioned kinds of radios where you had to get the dial exactly on the station or you would hear static. And we found that to be a very powerful metaphor of just trying to get the dial to say something in a way that the other person can take it in. So those are the most common challenges that we've found, and they have emerged in both the business field and in the education field. I mean, I usually ask people, what is the most common challenge you face in giving feedback or in receiving feedback? Or, can you think of a time when you received feedback that really worked well for you?
Yeah.
When was it? And what was it about the feedback that allowed you to take it in? Who gave it to you? What was your relationship with that person? And for the most part, a lot of people will say, it wasn't that the feedback was like warm feedback or soft feedback, or that it was, of any kind. It was more about the relationship between the two people, where the person who was the feedback receiver actually felt that the feedback giver was tuning in to sort of where they were, even if it was feedback that was hard to take at first.
I get it. I love that tuning in. I know Chris Munro uses that terminology quite a lot. When you said
Huh.
a lack of good feedback, do you mean a lack of in providing or giving feedback, or that we're not giving any affirming feedback, no positive feedback? When you say
Huh.
the lack of good feedback.
Uh-huh. Thanks so much for the question. So, and I'm sorry if that was a little bit confusing. When in the literatures, people say that feedback takes a big investment of time and care. And so when I say that what emerged was a lack of good feedback, it
Mm-hmm.
means feedback that actually helped the person.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that, because
Yeah, you're
I wasn't
welcome.
sure on that one. So in your work, you talk a lot about the importance of developmental approach to feedback and differentiation. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, about the differentiation and feedback.
Uh-huh. Happy to do so. The other common challenge, though, just circling back, rewinding a little bit, is that there's an over reliance on positive and affirmative feedback. So, and that can be problematic. I mean, I've been conducting research for, more than 30 years. And one of the things that principals and teachers often had said to me before we did this research for this book is that they wish that teachers would be able to give each other critical feedback. And that connected so deeply to the over reliance on on affirmative feedback. So, when I say a developmental approach to feedback, what I'm really talking about is that, there are three big ideas from developmental psychology. The first is that we actually see the world in very different ways. We don't all have the same internal resources. We are making meaning constantly. And I'm going to say a little bit about the three most common ways of knowing, ways of understanding, ways of making sense in adulthood. And then I'm going to talk about context as something that's really important to help us be able to take in feedback and also to grow. So, what our work does is it takes constructive developmental theory, which is a neo-Piagetian theory, meaning that it takes a lot of the ideas from Piaget. And I have to give my teacher, Bob Keegan, a big shout out. Woohoo! I've actually taken this theory and extended it to schools, and we've brought it as the foundation for a developmental approach to feedback. Mm-hmm. So basically, when I say a way of knowing, I'm talking about a meaning-making system or a developmental orientation, how we orient to the world. And it's a structure of mind. And I want to make a distinction between it is not whether someone has a growth mindset or a fixed mindset. Those things are important. Carol Dweck did amazing work her whole life around that. And her concept of not yet is a very powerful one, which illuminates the hopefulness and the promise of growth. So it's not that, though. When I say a meaning-making system, it's also not, Myers-Briggs, which can be a very helpful tool. Are we introverted or extroverted? Are we sensing or are we feeling? Those things are really important. And a lot of people in schools and education use those frameworks to help us understand ourselves and each other. This is not that. This is about a structure of mind where with each way of knowing or meaning-making system, we have something that we can't see about ourselves. It is our primary preoccupation. It is what is ultimately running us. We don't think about it. We don't see it. It's like the fish in water. The fish doesn't know it's in water. It runs our thinking. It runs our feelings. I'm going to call that what we are identified with or what we're subject to, what we can't see about ourselves. And with every meaning-making system, we also have things that we can see about ourselves and be responsible for and control. We can look at them. We can see into ourselves. That composes a meaning-making system, or what I call a way of knowing. But the most helpful thing is to understand that development, from my perspective, is all about perspective taking. So the more perspective a person can take on him, her, or themselves, another person, and the relationship, the better they're going to be able to manage themselves and complexity. So from this perspective, growth is really about increasing our cognition, our emotion, the way we relate to other people, and how deeply we can see into ourselves. So, but if you can just hold on to this thought of perspective taking and a way of knowing, it's really like a pair of glasses that we wear all the time, a way of knowing. And our lenses get bigger and bigger as we grow on the inside. So there are 4 primary ways of knowing in adulthood, but 3 are very common. And if you want to interrupt me,
no,
Andrea,
no, this is great, Ellie. Thank you.
Okay. Because I can just go on and on and on, you know.
That's what you're here for, to share your knowledge.
Okay, and these things matter with that whole big idea about differentiation. And that idea is connected, before I get into the ways of knowing, to these 3 other big ideas. 1 is that we see the world and make sense of it very differently. 2 is that because of that, we need to differentiate the kinds of supports, meeting someone where they are so that they feel well held, and challenges or developmental stretching. How do we push someone to grow in the psychological sense? How do we do that for people who make sense of the world in very different ways? We need to differentiate. And the third is that adulthood can be a time of tremendous growth, provided that we have contexts, or what we refer to as holding environments, relationships that help us to grow. Context is very, very important. It can be a school, it can be a team, it can be a coach, it can be a family, a relationship, a friendship. So the 3 main different ways of knowing are, I call the first one instrumental knowers. For them, what is their preoccupying concern is, how can I get the things I want and need? For them, what they want to know and need to know is, what did I do right and what did I do wrong? And if I did something wrong, can you tell me what are the steps to correcting it? Adults with every way of knowing have both strengths, developmental strengths, and growing edges. So what we're trying to do when we differentiate our feedback, or even, you know, whether we're inviting somebody into a leadership role or we're trying to help them with their teaming, is we try to meet someone where they are and then offer different kinds of challenges to help them grow. So for an instrumental knower, their growing edge is to be able to think abstractly in the psychological sense. And a quick example of that is, you know how we often say to each other, can you imagine how I felt when you, she, he, they did that? The fact of the matter is that that is a developmental capacity, to be able to stand in another person's shoes and take on their perspective. Instrumental knowers cannot do that yet. We say to people all the time, you know what, we had this discussion, and what I'd like you to do is go, and I'd like you to think about that, reflect on that, and when you come back in a few days, tell me what you think. An instrumental knower needs a step-by-step process. They need guidance and scaffolding in order to be able to do that, because they do not orient to an internal world yet. So when giving feedback to an instrumental knower, I mean, it's important for all of us to know what we did right and what we did wrong. It is essential, though, for an instrumental knower. That's what's top of mind, top of heart. They need to get it right. And if they do something wrong, they don't want to get caught or punished. So their growing edge is to get feedback in a way that's going to help them over time to be able to take on another person's perspective, to push their needs to the back burner, and to be concerned with another person's needs and wants and desires and wishes. So that's like the first way of knowing.
So would you say developing more internal dialogue, like thinking, talking to themselves as well?
Yes, okay. because for instrumental knowers, they don't understand, why you're asking them about how they feel, because they don't orient to an internal world. But over time, that kind of feedback can help them to grow. Yeah, that's a good summary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I keep it simple.
Yeah, that's great. No, I appreciate that. So when someone grows cognitively, emotionally, interpersonally, and intrapersonally, and this is important because often in life today, what is expected of us, either implicitly or explicitly, the demands placed on us often exceed what we can do. For socializing knowers, they have grown to not be run by their needs, wishes, and desires. They can push their own to the back burner. But what they are preoccupied with is pleasing you, their coach, their supervisor, their authority, their principal, their team leader. That is of ultimate importance to them. Their reality is co-constructed. What you think of a socializing knower is what they think of themselves. Your judgments.
People pleasers.
Yes. And, sometimes people say, well, for socializing knowers, can't they just get to be more self-confident? It's really not that. Remember, it's a structure of mind.
Okay.
For them, pleasing others, having your approval as their coach, as their supervisor, is feeling whole, like a whole person. Your feedback, socializing knowers often think that you know them better than they know themselves. Think about that.
Yeah.
So how do we help them grow? It's often, and this has to do with leadership roles and leadership opportunities as well. This was so painful. And so profound. So I teach, I do a lot of work with practitioners in, districts in the United States and around the world, and teaching them about these developmental ideas. And recently I had someone say to me, I think I'm a socializing knower because I have so many voices telling me what to do in my head. I have my parents, I have my boyfriend, I have all these voices that I hear when I need to make a decision. And what I want to do is I want to find my own voice. Right? So beautifully stated. And so as a coach to that person who's primarily concerned with what you think, but is moving a little bit outside of a socializing way of knowing, and is no longer totally and completely run by your opinions, your judgments. How do we help someone like that grow when giving feedback? Because all they want is your feedback as the supervisor, as the coach, as the principal, as the leader, and this takes time.
I was just thinking, Ellie, as a coach, you would say, what are others noticing about you if you achieve that goal? What would the students notice? What would other teachers notice? But maybe you should be saying, what would you notice? So it makes it more about themselves and what they're doing. So that might develop them in that way.
Yeah, that's so brilliant. And if what they really, really want is your feedback, help them, meet them where they are. Yeah. I am going to give you my feedback. I am going to tell you what I think. But what I would like to do is I'd like to give you a moment to think about what that would look like for you, what that would be like for you. What would you think and feel about yourself? I want to know what you think before I tell you what I think. That's how we help someone to begin to look on the inside as opposed to only looking on the outside.
Yeah. It's sort of like an external validation from others before themselves. Yeah.
Reality for a socializing knower is actually co-constructed, though, with you and another person. They are lost in a swirl of loyalties because they want to please and have the approval of their team leader, of their coach, of their principal. They want
their students, everything. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes. That's such a great point.
Yeah.
Such a great point. And So as they're growing, they're developing more internal capacities. Now, there are other adults who grow on the inside and they develop, over time, an internal bench of judgment. What are they run by? They're no longer run by having your approval. They are run by having their own approval. What is preoccupying them is, am I working, living, loving up to my own fullest potential? They not only want to get feedback from you as their coach, as their principal, as their team leader, they want to give you feedback too. They can do that. The relationship isn't at risk for them. That's part of a good relationship. That's part of how we move forward in our teaching, in our leading, in our teaming. What is hard for them, though? What is hard for them is to take in perspectives that feel like they're so diametrically opposed to their own. What else is hard for them? Their other growing edge. It's almost like they have a suit of armor on. Is to open that up and critique themselves. That's really hard. Sometimes principals say, well, how can I give feedback to my cabinet? I think I have a whole group of self-authoring knowers, and or I want to present this new idea, or I want to formulate this new idea all together. And I say, well, can you just ask everybody to hold back a little bit until you have a chance to share that and to talk about it together? And there is life beyond a self-authoring, which is that way of knowing where a person has a bench of judgment, creates their own values and standards, can give feedback, can take in feedback, but in the end, they're going to decide what they're going to do themselves.
Right.
And the last way of knowing that has become increasingly common in adulthood is what I call self-transforming knowers. Those are adults who are constantly critiquing themselves and trying to grow other parts of themselves that are not as well developed as their central, ideology.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot more interpenetrability between self systems, and they are constantly trying to receive feedback and give feedback in a way that helps in conversation to explore the paradoxes and inconsistencies in themselves, in relationships, in systems, in around the world as well. So that's a lot to take in. I'm going to press pause for a minute, Andrea, and see if you have any questions for me right now. That highlights, in some ways, I hope, the importance of being able to differentiate when we give feedback so that someone can actually take it in and do something with it.
Yeah. And I'm just going to open it up to people can ask us questions by using the Q&A chat box, or follow us on Curious Convos at the hashtag Curious Convos. Ellie, I'm just thinking, if you're in a new context, if you're in a new role, if you're in a new position, does it change? Because it sounds to me everything's built on relationships. So if you don't have established relationships, could you find yourself being more like just following the rules and ticking the boxes and making sure I'm right if it was a new role, a new position, and you hadn't established the relationships and you were just needing to prove yourself? I'm feeling like, does context make the difference in the way in which your developmental place is? Do you know what I'm saying?
I know exactly what you're saying. So, and it brings up three things for me. The first is that as we grow, the former way of knowing becomes part of a larger system.
Right.
And we can always pull on those parts of ourselves that we had before. But what's harder is to reach forward without some kind of external help. So that's like one point. The second point is, yes, when we are in new situations and the challenge is so high, we often resort to, just tell me what the rules are and how to get this done, because I need to do it the right way. I need to do it the right way on behalf of what? Is it because I want to get a reward? Or is it because I have a mission of being able to contribute? And in order for me to do that, I need to get the rules down? And is it also because we all have to follow rules? We all have mandates. But what is it on behalf of is the second big question. People will tell you. You ask them, they'll tell you.
I love that though, that you said you could pull it in. I loved that because you could draw on it, and it's not like you move on and you don't go back at that
right
place. You might need to go back there in certain situations if the challenges are too high for you, if you're feeling out of your comfort zone, in that panic zone. Just tell me what I need to do to get through this. Yeah.
Absolutely. And often we need to do that. We're in new situations. We take on new leadership roles. We've got a million things going on in this go, go, go world, right? And, maybe someone else is really good at this other part, and we just lean into them. Can you help me? Can you tell me, how did you get this done? Lay out the steps. Give me the best practices. Yes. What we're trying to discern, though, and we can do this with questions, to figure out where someone is. They might be making meaning with two dominant ways of knowing. We're trying to figure out what is of ultimate importance to them. What is running them? The other thing, which is the third point, is that someone can be in a new context or an old context. And they could be asked, what I want you to do is, I want the big boss might say, what I want you to do is, I want you to give me some feedback. I want you to tell me how you think it went, like all the good stuff and all the other stuff. And you might say to yourself, I've seen what happens to people when they tell you the critical feedback. They're no longer here. So we can also consciously decide not to do that. That's your point, your excellent point, Andrea, about context. Context matters. We might also be in a relationship and someone might ask for feedback, and we might feel like, you know what? Right now is not the right time to give them that feedback.
Oh, I so get that, Ellie. Especially, I'm thinking at the end of our school year. Everybody's. It's been 2020 has been a difficult year for a lot, like for everyone, I'd say. And I think choosing the right time is, and if you know the person and you have a relationship, then you have to know that about them, and you have to pick the right time, not the end of the day or end of the school year.
Absolutely. Sometimes even if we can't see the person, say we're not on Zoom or we're not in person, and we pick up the phone and we say hello, and the person says hello back, and if we know them really well, and right away in their voice, or maybe it's a couple of words, we can hear, something's not right, and we decide, I'm not going to get into that now. It's the end of the year or the end of the day, or something must have happened. The other thing, though, that I think is connected to that, Andrea, is if we have feedback for someone, what we're trying to do is build feedback cultures so that feedback doesn't just happen once a year, and, if you go up to someone and you say, can I give you some feedback on that meeting we were just in? And the person says, not right now. I've had one of those days where I can't take in 1 ounce, not another, no more input. I would pay attention to that.
Yeah. Awesome. And what else would I ask you about feedback? Have you experienced why did you find that this topic's so interesting for yourself? Is it something that you experienced, or were you noticing things about other people? Why did this topic of feedback capture you to do all this work for so many years in this area?
That's such a good question.
That I know that wasn't on our
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. It's such a good question. I was just finishing a book, Helping Educators Grow, and it had just come out, and I was having lunch with the editor of the book in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and she said to me, what are you thinking about these days? I remember the moment. It was August. It was, a beautiful summer day in the United States. And I said, I'm thinking a lot about feedback. I'm thinking a lot about how hard it is for people to give feedback even when they're asked for it. And I'm also thinking about how much we all need feedback. Like I have people in my life who, sometimes people give you feedback even if you don't ask for it. you
Yes.
know, yes, people who know us well, people who love us, people who care about us, but also, I was noticing um, in schools, in my work with teachers, I do a lot of work with teachers and principals, and feedback was something that was coming up so predominantly, especially in relationship to evaluations, because in the United States, evaluations became like at the forefront. And it was not just doing it once a year. It was, we had all different models for doing evaluations, as I know you do too. It's a hot topic. And that was coming out, and principals were like isolating themselves to do the reports. Many people were saying to me that I coached, I'm really good at giving feedback on paper, but it's when I have to sit down eye to eye and say it out loud. Teachers were saying this, principals were saying this, coaches were saying this. And I was like, we have to do something about this.
Do you find, Ellie, that avoidance of giving the feedback, or always saying we don't have time to be in each other's classrooms, or, because it's time consuming, because it takes time. But do you think that avoidance then causes the issues of more concerned based feedback, when you have to give more, if we give more regular feedback about growth, and if it's coming from a place of genuine, I want to make you a better person and I'm here for you, that's different. So when you were saying, when people give you feedback when you don't ask for it, it's funny how you go to people for feedback that you feel that you trust them, that they're doing it for you. Do you know what I mean? And that the purpose of them providing feedback is for your growth. So I think that the importance of a relationship can't be emphasized enough. If you believe that person providing feedback is there for you and not to tick a box or for any other reason, I think you will accept the feedback, or you seek more feedback. Would you say that you found that in any of your research?
Yes. I mean, that saying that's all often attributed to Emerson, what you're doing is speaking so loudly, I can't hear what you're saying, And so I think it is about the relationship. Often I'll ask the question, can you think about a time when you received feedback that really helped you? What was it about the person, the place, the position, the feedback? And it's often that people will say, well, I felt like the person respected me, or I felt like the person had my back, or I trust the person. There's no such thing as a little trust problem. Either, you know what I mean?
It's either there or it's not, right?
Right. And I do agree with you, Andrea, that if a person feels that way, that they can trust the person giving the feedback, it's so much, even if the feedback is, hard at first, they'll simmer on it, and they'll go back more and more. That's what I mean about a culture of feedback. But you need the audios to match the visuals. You can't just say, oh, I'm doing this for your own good. People have to feel that.
That's right. That's right. And I love the way you said simmer on it, because I know I've received feedback and, you take it in. But then when you process it over a few days or even a week or two, you're thinking, all right, I can see parts of that, because you're thinking to yourself, where can I grow? What can I take from them? There are some things you might say, well, that person doesn't know me that well, and they might have, you know what I mean? You're struggling with the feedback to work it out in your own perspective.
Yeah.
But it takes time, I think, sometimes when you provide feedback. I know, some people, when you give feedback, they might be upset, but then they come back, or they need that little bit of time to process.
Yes. I think we all do, that simmering, the simmering process and the growth process. And it does take time to digest a little bit. It's kind of like, I remember I had this colleague, and I gave him, a copy of a book that I was writing, and he read it and he gave me some really good feedback. And one of the things he said was, hey, Ellie, You got to put the pain in that book. Growth is hard. You have to put more of that in. And at first, when he said that to me, I was like, wow. And I thought about it and I thought, you know what? He's right. Because it's sort of like when you look at a chrysalis, in order to become a butterfly, the pupa inside has to break out of that chrysalis, or the lobster, when it's growing, it has to break out of that shell. And that's a painful process. Feedback can help us to become butterflies, regardless of our position or wherever we are in the world. Feedback is really one of the primary ways that we can grow. And that's why I think it's so important for us to get better at it and to help other people to get better at it. And one of the ways that I've found really effective in my coaching to help people get better at giving feedback is to role play with them,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll say, do you think you could say this, ... And the person will say to me, well, no, I can't say that, but I could say this. And I'll be like, okay, let's practice that, because it is like building a muscle. The same thing with, differentiating from a developmental perspective. It takes practice. How do we get good at anything? We practice, we build our muscles, and feedback is like that too. And we have to be gentle with ourselves, so that it lands. It takes time to
So would you say preparation as well? So preparation.
Oh, totally. What do we do before we give feedback?
Mm-hmm.
What kinds of questions do we ask? Even asking someone about a time when they got good feedback, what was that like? Or a time when they got feedback that was so overwhelming they couldn't take it in. What was it about that feedback? And if we are genuinely and authentically, transparent and they feel that we're trying to help them, I always ask permission, before giving feedback. And I know that sometimes we have to give feedback on the fly, and sometimes we have to give really hard feedback. There's a continuum of feedback. Sometimes we have to give constructive feedback where we're actually telling someone what we need them to do differently. And other times we're giving feedback that's much more inquiry oriented, where we're trying to understand how the person was making sense of what they said, did, or what happened. And there's a lot in between.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I could just keep talking to you.
Look, I say, yeah, we could talk for hours, Ellie. But
Yes.
I've got a few questions for you. You mentioned that more of us at the self-transforming way of knowing. Can you say more about that change? Do we see it in all fields? And this is from Jennifer Abrams in Palo Alto in California. So,
wow, that's a nice question. Thank you, Jennifer. So, I don't have research on that, but I would imagine, yes. The research that I, have read about is that there has been an increase in the self-transforming way of knowing. For example, in 1994, it was estimated that 3 to 5% of the adults, according to meta-analyses in the world, were making meaning with a self-transforming way of knowing. And that number has since then at least doubled. And depending on who you look at, it's more than that. And so I would say that it's not exclusive to education or to any one field. I think it's a global phenomenon, given the state of affairs around the world.
yeah, well, her next question was, how do you see the 3 pandemics challenging self-authoring knowers?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, so how do we get better at giving feedback? How do we get better at giving feedback? We said preparation and practice. Is there anything else you can, yeah?
Go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say, is there anything more more that we can do? I've found reading has really helped me, but then you take your text, but then you have to apply it for your experiences. As you said before, you asked people, how did you receive feedback and how did that land with you and what made it so difficult and what made it, helped you grow? What was it about that? I find that when I'm reading your book and other books, I'm using it for my experiences and why, oh, that explains why I felt this way. And now I'm thinking how I've provided feedback and how I could better provide feedback. But it also comes back to that relationship and how to have a really transparent conversation about feedback. I think it's sort
Yeah.
of like something we don't talk about. It's something that, is given off the cuff a lot of the times, or very formally provided, on a piece of paper once you've had somebody come in and view your classroom for an hour. So just
Yeah.
wondering what you think about that.
I think that's a really, what's happening for me is I'm thinking about something that so I think practice, to answer your question, helps us to give better feedback. I'm also thinking about, having a feedback buddy,
Mhm.
someone who you trust. My husband was cleaning something and he accidentally fell, and he broke his finger. And the thing is, the doctors said that you need a buddy splint, and David
Mhm.
said, well, what does that do? And he said, it makes the finger that's broken stronger, and it protects it. And I thought, wow, that is such a cool metaphor for how we can get better at giving feedback, is we can have someone that we trust that we can practice with. So that is what I would say. I think reading really helps. But the thing that you said, that really struck me, which I think is really true, and it brings up a couple of really important points. You said that, I'm thinking about myself when I'm reading, and I'm thinking about my own growing edges. And like, I do that all the time. I feel so blessed to have people in my life who, you know, are there, and they are, both supporting me, but also pushing at my edges, helping me to, oh, wow, I never thought about that before.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then I'll simmer on that, and I'll think about it, and I'll try to improve and grow myself in that way. And it's not always, I mean, it's definitely not easy, but I want to get better and I want to become better. And the other point that you raised was, our own internal capacities influence how we can be of good support to each other. And we really, really need each other to grow. So, when we're thinking about, when you said that when you were reading, Andrea, that that you were thinking about yourself, I mean, I think that's really helpful and healthy, because I mean, what are we modeling if we're not also trying to grow ourselves, you
Mhm.
know? And I mean, sometimes the feedback, you know, sometimes it's hard for other people to give us feedback, or sometimes we get feedback. I remember I asked someone who's in a leadership position that I work with, at my school, and I said, I just like to get some feedback from you around what I could get better at, you know?
Did
And
you leave it that open? Like you weren't
yeah, I
really.
did.
Okay. Yeah.
I did. And I said this in person, and he said, well, I really need to think about that. And then he sent me an email and he said, I think the thing you need to get better at is stop being so nice. Stop saying so many thank yous. And I was like, whoa, you know, I mean, that's like at the central part of my core. I mean, if you would have met my mom, you would be like, oh, you're definitely your mom's daughter. If you would have met my dad, you'd be like, oh, you're definitely your dad's daughter. And those two put together. So that is something that I think a lot about. But yes, I did ask it that openly. And I last night I was doing one of my colleagues asked me to help her out and do a it's a Zoom class, at Teachers College. And so, one of the students who happens to be in the medical profession, he was telling a story about how he was giving feedback to this other doctor. He
Mm.
teaches doctors and they have to use all different kinds of assessments. And he was giving the person the feedback, and she was getting more and more defensive, he felt.
Mhm.
And he didn't know what to do. And I asked him, did you say something to her about that you were experiencing, that A, you were trying to help her, and B, you were getting the sense that she was being defensive. And the reason that you're raising up these issues is because, she's going to be held accountable for them. And he said, no, I didn't. And I know that he's probably going to go back, the next time he has that. And I said, well, what do you think would happen if you said that to her? And he said, I don't know, but I'm going to do it the next time.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes, it doesn't have to be a directive. It can actually be a question that helps us to get better at giving feedback, something that we're wondering about.
I'm still thinking about you receiving that feedback about saying thank you too much and being positive. Is that more of a is that more just his perspective on things, or is it, do you know what I'm saying? Like, you have the choice whether you go, no, that's me, or you have the choice to say, I'm sorry, you know what I mean? Thank you, but no, thank you. So when you give feedback, it's really up to you whether you take it on, correct?
Yes.
So, maybe she was getting defensive, but really ultimately it's her who, whether she takes on that feedback or she doesn't.
Yes.
Correct.
Yes.
And by the way, I love all your thank yous and your emails. I think there's more people need to do that in the world, honestly. I've got another question for you.
Okay.
Sunny Melbourne today. On the flip side to how to be better at giving feedback, how do we get better at receiving feedback or helping others become more receptive to feedback? Thanks, Max from Melbourne.
Thanks, Max from Melbourne. Good morning. Yes. So that's a really good question. I think part of it is, emphasizing that the reason behind our feedback, you know what I mean? So there are these preconditions, and I think these will resonate with Max from Melbourne and with a lot of us. Safety, trust, and respect. We actually found this in our research when we interviewed people about how do you support adult development in general through feedback, when you're mentoring, when you're coaching. And the people in this particular, it was a mixed method study, it was a longitudinal study. And the great majority of them said, well, you can know all about theory and you can know all about adult development, but if people don't trust you, if they don't feel that you respect them and they don't feel safe, Amy Edmondson has a construct in coaching around psychological safety, which is actually a construct that is gleaned from the developmental construct of the holding environment. How do we meet people where they are? How do we gently, help them to grow through developmental stretching when they're ready? And then how do we stay in place when those capacities are very fragile, when it's like when someone's beginning to ride a bike and you take the tricycle wheels off, you want to stay there to make sure that they don't fall until they've gotten the swing of it. So I think it's how you present it, what is the intention behind the feedback? Why are we giving the feedback? And if those conditions, safety, trust, and respect exist, and I just want to say that those mean different things to people with these different ways of knowing, or, people who are wearing, different glasses, you know what I mean? So that,
nice prop, Sally.
Yeah. No, I had these for the class, and you notice the lenses, they're much bigger. They can see more on the outside and more on the inside. And so safety, trust, and respect mean different things. How do we grow those? As I said before, I guess, to Max in Melbourne and to all of us, we start with the small things. I really believe that people need to feel met where they are without an urgent need to make them change. They need to feel like you actually care about them. And we have to care about them. People sense that, whether it's a child, an adolescent, or an adult, and I really do believe that if they feel like you care about them and you have some kind of a relationship, you can give feedback, and maybe they'll be defensive, but maybe you can name that. Or maybe you could say, I'm really nervous about giving you this feedback because I care so much about our relationship, but I really feel it's important. I mean, last night in this class that I was doing, this woman who works with physicians as well, she said, I just feel like I have to give feedback around, that people have a hard time talking about race and equity and gender differences in my field. But I'm afraid to say that. And I said, well, how do you think people would take it in if you said that? If you
Up
said
front,
that,
if you said,
yeah, I think that would open them up a lot.
Definitely. It sort of puts everything on the table, doesn't it? Where I'm coming
Yes.
from, what the purpose of this is.
Yes.
I think a lot of things come back to purpose. I have another question for you, Ali. This is
Okay,
from
great.
Deb Nedelicki over in Perth. I know you know Deb. I'm wondering about how we develop cultures where it's not just the more junior people receiving feedback, but where colleagues are willing and able to give leaders at a highest level honest feedback. So providing feedback up.
Yeah.
Right.
Thanks for the question, Deb. So, I mean, so if the leaders are above us, giving feedback, like kind of managing up, but also the question of, I really do feel like we're never all done, and I think that we all have different gifts and we all have different strengths and we all have different growing edges. And I think having conversations about that, like actually talking with a group that is maybe very senior, that, saying that I think we can help each other grow and that we can all give and receive feedback it's not just the new people. Even if it is feedback that doesn't know, I try to always ask for feedback. That is not an easy thing for people to do. But asking permission to give feedback really opens up a space, honoring. So like for self-authoring knowers, we have to honor where they are, honor their competency. And I think that's really important with people who are more senior and who have had tons and tons of experience, and maybe they've won a lot of awards for coaching. That doesn't mean that there aren't growing edges for them as well. And I think one thing, that you and I have talked about is about being vulnerable ourselves and, admitting that, we have our own growing edges. I don't know anyone who doesn't have any areas for growth. And I think, insight into ourselves and being willing to be transparent about our own growing edges can help other people do the same. I think that kind of modeling of vulnerability as strength can really help people. And it's not like it's going to happen tomorrow, but I think people do think about things like that.
But I think, Ellie, this is an area that not a lot of people know about. As I said, I wished I knew earlier about this before, just when I started teaching. And when I became a leader, I wish I knew more about this to understand people better, understand myself better, and then you know how it lands with other people. But I'm just thinking, if I were in a school and you could create this part of your professional learning, because providing feedback, whether it's to your colleagues or to your students, so many times where, good job, well, what does a good job really mean? Are we specific about what we're providing feedback on? Is it authentic and is it timely? So all of those things, it can be related to teachers, leaders, but also to our students. So I just think this is you're an untapped resource, Ali, that I really wish a lot of people knew more about, because it would have made my life a lot easier. And I think I would have supported more people and helped their potential, growing their potential. But I love the growing edges. I just love that, because I have this visualization of just, moving on and growing. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Oh, we've got a lot more questions here. I know your time is precious too. I have an excellent, transparent relationship with all my staff. Safety, respect, and trust are a must. However, I have a staff member who is extremely defensive when any constructive feedback is provided. Can you advise any alternative strategies? That's from
Mm,
Scotland.
huh. Thank you for the question. I know it's late at night where you are, right?
Yes, it's
Uh,
very late for them.
yes, exactly. So, I mean, I guess uh, defensiveness means different things, and I wonder what might happen if I mean, I often advise, have you ever given someone feedback over and over again and nothing happens, or every time you give feedback you feel like the person is so defensive? So I mean, I wonder what might happen if you actually said that. you know I notice that whenever I give you feedback, I mean, I can give you different kinds of feedback. When I give you this kind of feedback, you seem to welcome it and take it in. But my experience, what I observe, is that when I give you this other kind of feedback, I just feel like you shut down. And I wanted to be able to say that to you. And I'm wondering what your experience is of me when I give you that feedback. I'm also, I would ask these one at a time and let the person answer. You know, how do you feel when I give you feedback? Or, you know, can you tell me what's going on for you when I give you that feedback? Because what I'm feeling is that you're defensive. And I want to say, first of all, that the reason I'm giving you this feedback is because I'm trying to help. I mean, people usually know. I mean, it's not easy. I mean, I was coaching someone, in the United States, we have Teach for America, and when a teacher is not doing well in the classroom, they get assigned a coach. And the coach goes in and the coach videotapes, and this can go on for 6 weeks, and every week the coach is trying to help the person develop different skills. So I was coaching the coach who was going in, and this coach said that the first week the teacher, implemented all the strategies. The second week the teacher was able to implement some of the strategies. The third week the teacher just stopped implementing the strategies. And I said, "Did you ask why?" And the coach said, "No, but I know that the teacher was talking about me behind my back. And what I'm trying to do is help the teacher meet the benchmarks, because if the teacher doesn't meet the benchmarks by May, the teacher is going to get fired." And I said, "Do you think the teacher knows that?" And the coach said, "I don't know." I said, "Well, I think you should say that." And maybe you also want to say that if I'm not the right person, I mean, if you're talking about me, maybe you need a different coach, because I'm committed to your success. And if I'm not the person who can help you, maybe someone else can. But here's the bottom line. In the end, you need to demonstrate these competencies, or you're not going to be able to teach in this school and in this program. So that's a long answer to defensiveness. But I think one of the most helpful things that we can do is help someone else to, you know, to,
Become aware.
yeah, become aware, to name it, and
Yeah.
to inquire about it.
If you stay in
Because,
that space of curiosity and not judgment, I think it's more likely to move forward, correct? If you
yeah, I
if you
think
just take
so.
that curious stand of inquiry and questioning more than this is what I'm seeing, why?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That's a beautiful synopsis. Yeah.
Oh, Ellie, I could talk to you for a long time, but it's 10:04 here, so I know it's
Okay.
later for you. Well, evening for you. I want to thank you so much for sharing your experience, your research, your knowledge. Um, it's been wonderful, and I thank everyone. There's quite a few people from around the world watching, and I know there's a lot of people going to be looking at this later on. So thank you so much. I hope you
Thank
have
you
a
so much.
wonderful end of the year for 2020, and I'm sure we'll be talking very soon.
Yes.
Thanks everyone for
Thank
joining us.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you so much, Andrea, for inviting me. It's been an absolute honor and privilege. I'm really grateful. Thank
I'm
you.
looking forward to meeting you face to face in Australia one day.
Me too. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Okay. Good
everyone.
day. Good day.